Chapter 15 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 15. A Surprising Reappearance. It was about 3 weeks later that, as Billy and I foregathered in the living room of the bungalow, early on a certain morning, discussing our biscuit and early cup of coffee prior to setting out for the matutinal bath that always preceded the work of the day, Billy asked, "By the way, Mr. Blackburn, did Kit disturb you at all last night? He was so uneasy that I had to turn out twice and go to him, and both times I found him standing at the top of the veranda steps, straining at his leash. Latterly, we always tied him up at night, switching his tail fiercely and uttering half-suppressed growls, as though he scented or heard something unusual prowling near the house. It was only by staying with him for about half an hour that I at last succeeded in quieting him down. You see, I was afraid he would awake you, and I knew how frightfully tired you must be after your long day's work at the cutter, under the broiling sun. I hope no apes or other unpleasant creatures have found their way to Eden, and are lurking to frighten the life out of me." "I think you need not greatly fear," said I. "All the same, there was probably a cause for Kit's uneasiness, which, by the way, did not in the least disturb me, for I never heard him, and we may as well try to discover what it was. Therefore, after breakfast, I will take the rifle and give a look around." It was, however, unnecessary to wait until after breakfast for the elucidation of the mystery, for when Billy and I reached the beach, upon which stood the nearly complete hull of the cutter, two ragged, unkempt, sunburnt scarecrows emerged from the shadow of the craft and approached me. "Mornin', mister," remarked the taller of the pair, in a would-be hearty tone of voice that nevertheless somehow suggested cringing, as did his manner. "Well, here we are again, turned up like bad pennies. Just in time, by the looks of it, to help ye finish this dandy yacht and sail her to wherever you thinks of goin'." "What!" I exclaimed, in inexpressible amazement. "Can it be possible that you are Svorenssen and Van Ryn? Why, I believed that you and all the rest of the crew of the Yorkshire Lass were drowned when she was wrecked more than a year ago." "So we was, mister, very nigh," replied Svorenssen. "There was only 3 of us, besides you and Billy, that escaped, and that was me, Dirk here, and a chap named Flemin', Pete we used to call him. When the ship struck we was all washed overboard by the first sea as broke aboard, and naturally those of us as could swim struck out as soon as our heads rose above water. But I say, mister, ain't there no breakfast knockin' about? We haven't ate nothin' since yesterday afternoon, and we're feelin' pretty sharp set, I can tell ye." "Breakfast?" I reiterated. "Why, of course. It will be ready in about an hour's time. But you cannot come up to the house as you are. You know, by the way, were you by any chance prowling about in the neighbourhood of the house last night?" "Aye, we was," answered Svorenssen. "We landed on the beach below it, and made it out at once in the moonlight. We guessed as it was yours, and we was for rousin' you out to give us a bite o' supper, but that dog o' yours growled so vicious, and seemed so savage, that we decided to wait till this mornin'." "It was extremely fortunate for you that you did," said I. "The dog, as you call him, happens to be a leopard, and if you had persisted in your attempt to approach the house, the pair of you would assuredly have been killed. I tell you this at once, by way of warning." "The beast will have to be chained oop, else how are we goin' in and out o' the house?" demanded Van Ryn. "You will not go in and out of the house," I retorted. "There is no room for you there. Then just look at yourselves. You are as indecent in the matter of your clothing as you are filthy in your persons. Before anything else you will have to cleanse yourselves, and be clothed decently. The condition of your clothes you cannot help, I suppose, being castaways for more than a year, but you might at least have kept your bodies clean. You are disgustingly verminous, both of you, and after you have made a meal your first business must be to get yourselves clean. You will remain here while Billy and I go up to the house and bring you down some breakfast, after which I must see what can be done to make you reasonably presentable." "All right, mister," answered Svorenssen. "We'll keep clear of the 'ouse, never fear. We don't want to be tore to pieces by no leopards, after tryin' our utmost for over a year to get to ye, and lend a hand in whatever you might be doin' to get away from this ruddy hole. We're just as anxious as you can be to get away from it, you may bet on that." "Well," said I to Billy, as we turned away to retrace our steps to the house, our bath completely forgotten, "this reappearance of Svorenssen and Van Ryn is a surprise, and not altogether an agreeable one at that. I never particularly liked either of them. They impressed me from the very beginning as being insubordinate of disposition and impatient of discipline, and I have not forgotten the character that the boatswain and Chips gave them." "How did they behave before I joined the Yorkshire lass, Billy? Had your father ever had trouble with them?" "Yes, in some ways a good deal," answered Billy. "What the boatswain and Chips said about them was quite true. They and the other two foreigners were always quarrelling with the rest of the forecastle hands. They wanted to do only just what work suited them, and not what father wanted them to do. And from what the other men said, I believe that the Dagos would have mutinied if it had not been for the chance of getting hold of and sharing the treasure." Returning to the house, Billy and I snatched a hasty meal, and then we started back for the beach, bearing with us food, 2 suits of the lightest clothing the slop chest afforded, 2 blue-striped shirts, 2 cloth caps, soap, towels, a comb, and a pair of scissors. The 2 seamen were too hungry to talk much while discussing their meal, nor did I attempt to question them just then, curbing my curiosity until a more favourable opportunity to satisfy it should present itself, and when the pair had finished eating I marched them off to the river, where, handing them the soap and towels, I bade them strip, enter the water, and thoroughly cleanse themselves from the accumulated grime of a year's neglect. This at length done, I set them to cut each other's hair and beard, and generally render themselves as decent looking and respectable as was possible. After which I handed them their new clothes, and bade them burn their old rags. They seemed to consider me quite unreasonably particular, and grumbled a good deal at what they appeared to regard as the wholly unnecessary trouble I was imposing upon them. But I would take no denial, and when at length they realized that I intended to have my way, they surlily submitted. In the end I believe that, in spite of themselves, they were rather glad that I had been so insistent, for when they once more stood fully clothed, their appearance was improved almost beyond recognition, and they seemed quite pleased with themselves. They were by no means so pleased, however, when, in response to a remark by one of them, I gave them to clearly understand that I would not house them in the bungalow, and that during the comparatively short period of our further stay on the group they would have to be content with the accommodation as a tent would afford. They argued hotly that, being castaways and survivors from the same shipwreck, we all stood upon a perfectly equal footing, and were alike entitled to share equally in everything. To which I replied that the bungalow, the sailing boat, and the cutter were all mine, built with my own hands out of material salved by me from the wreck, that they had not participated or helped in the slightest degree in any of the salving or building operations. Therefore, I considered they were not entitled to claim any share in the comforts or advantages arising from those operations, but that, as an act of grace, I was prepared to allow them a reasonable share of those comforts and advantages, while, if they would help me to complete the cutter, make her ready for sea, and assist me on the voyage, they should be welcome to a passage in her. For a heated 5 minutes I believed I was in for very serious trouble with the two men, but in the midst of the argument, which was chiefly between Van Ryn and myself, Svorenssen intervened, drawing his companion away and saying a few hasty words that seemed to have the effect of wonderfully calming the Dutchman's excitement, and the dispute ended by their admitting, rather lamely I thought, that since I was evidently master of the situation, they supposed they must make the best of it, and accept what I chose to give them. As to helping with the completion of the cutter, they expressed themselves as only too willing to do so, since they had had more than enough of Robinson Crusoeing it. "Now," said I to them as, their toilet at length completed, we moved away from the stream, "I must again warn you both to keep well clear of the house. I have already told you that the animal which you last night mistook for a dog is a leopard. Now that you have arrived on the island, I shall be obliged to keep him tied up, but if you approach the house it will be at your peril, for if Kit sees or scents either of you he will probably break adrift, and you will simply be torn limb from limb. He is a most ferocious creature, and will not tolerate strangers. So bear in mind what I say, and give him a wide berth." "But I vants to see the house," protested Van Ryn. "How am I to do that?" "You will have to forego that pleasure, so that's all there is about it," I replied dryly. "If the brute interferes mit me, I vill kill him," threatened the Dutchman. "Will you?" said I. "Why, man, you would stand no more chance with that leopard than if you were the merest baby. But enough of this. You had better pitch your tent on the beach, close to the cutter. Go down there now, and choose a spot to suit yourselves, and Billy and I will come down later on with a sail, pole, and what other gear is necessary, and help you rig it up." By mid-afternoon the tent, consisting of the brigantine's forecourse which I had salved, was satisfactorily rigged up, a trench dug around it to carry off water in the event of rain, and a sufficiency of rude but efficient furniture stored within it; and, somewhat to my surprise, the pair who were to occupy it expressed themselves as quite satisfied. Then, since it was too late in the day to do much work upon the cutter, I invited the seamen to give me a detailed account of how they had fared since the wreck. It was Svorenssen who undertook to tell the story, and he told it in the coarse, uncouth language of the forecastle, embellishing and emphasizing it here and there, after the manner of the shellback, by the introduction of words and phrases comprehensible enough to me, but confusing and quite unintelligible to a landsman. I shall therefore take the liberty of translating the narrative into plain, simple English, for the benefit of my readers. Thus translated, it ran as follows. "It must have been about half an hour after Chips came forward with the news that you had met with an accident and had been carried down into your cabin, and the gale was still blowing as heavy as ever, when some of us on the forecastle thought we heard another sound above the shriek of the wind and the hiss of the sea; and, looking ahead, we presently saw, stretching away on both bows, as far as we could see, an unbroken line of wildly leaping breakers and flying spray. We at once hailed the quarter-deck, shouting, 'Breakers ahead, and on both bows!' But it is exceedingly doubtful whether or not we were heard, and if we had been it would have made no difference, for before anything could be done the ship was among the breakers, and a second later she struck, not very hard, but just sufficiently so to cant us broadside on. Then she struck again, and hung until a tremendous sea broke aboard, sweeping her decks, and doubtless washing all hands on deck overboard. At all events, that sea took me and swept me helplessly over the bows, as also Van Ryn and another man named Fleming, but I knew nothing about them until the next morning. Being a swimmer, I instinctively struck out, and I had not made more than a dozen strokes before my hand struck something that I at once seized and clung to. It proved to be a bit of topgallant bulwark, about 6 feet long, and it afforded me a most welcome support, especially as the seas were still breaking over me so furiously that it was only with the utmost difficulty I contrived to snatch a breath between whiles. But the breaking seas that came near to smothering me were also sweeping me away fast to leeward, and after a time I found myself in smoother water. The seas no longer broke over me, and the water being quite warm, I experienced no discomfort, apart from the uncertainty as to what was to eventually happen to me, and I just kept paddling along to leeward, following the run of the seas. I might have been overboard about half an hour when, clearing the salt water out of my eyes, I caught the loom of land ahead, through the darkness, the sight of which greatly cheered me, for I had no doubt of my ability to hold out until I could reach the shore, and I had the comforting conviction that where there was land there was also safety. About an hour later I found myself again among breakers, but they were a mere trifle compared with those that I had already encountered, and shortly afterward my feet touched bottom, and, abandoning the fragment of wreckage to which I had been clinging, I crawled up the beach to above high water mark, flung myself down upon the warm sand, and instantly fell asleep. When I awoke, the sun was shining brilliantly, and the gale had broken, although it was still blowing a strong breeze. I looked out to seaward, and at once sighted the wreck, about 2 miles away, dismasted and hard and fast upon the reef. Then, glancing at my surroundings, I perceived that I had landed upon a beach of fine white sand, backed by country densely wooded, with hills stretching away to north and south. The sight of the trees suggested possibilities of fruit, the thought of which reminded me that I was hungry, and I was about to make a plunge into the woods in search of something to eat when I heard a voice hailing, and, looking in the direction from which the hail had come, I saw, to my great satisfaction, Van Ryn and Fleming, about 1/4 of a mile along the beach. Naturally, we at once joined forces, and they, being like myself hungry, we forthwith proceeded to hunt for food, speedily finding an abundance of cocoanuts that had fallen, ripe, from the trees that lined the inner edge of the beach. We ate and drank our fill of the fruit and milk of the nuts, and then, having meanwhile discussed our plans for the future, we began our quest for a practicable path inland, for the idea of camping on the beach, night after night, had few attractions for us. But the undergrowth was so dense and impenetrable that it was not until we had traversed quite a mile of the beach, under the rays of a scorching sun, that we at length found a spot where, by cutting and hacking the monkey rope and creepers with our knives, we finally succeeded in working our way into a valley enclosed between 2 ranges of hills running practically parallel. My word, that was hot work, I assure you, Mr. Blackburn. Of course, there was no lack of shade, but on the other hand, there was no air. The atmosphere was simply stifling, and what with that and the labour of hewing a way through the dense undergrowth, much of it consisting of bushes covered with tough, sharp thorns that got hold of our clothes, and not infrequently our skins, and refused to let go. The perspiration poured from us like water and simply drenched our clothes. But the monkey rope, the creepers, the thorns, and the heat were not the worst of our troubles. The whole place was swarming with mosquitoes that hovered about us in clouds and bit us savagely in 100 places at once. And, as though these were not enough, there were myriads of small black ants that penetrated our clothing and bit us even more savagely than the mosquitoes. Luckily, we did not encounter the ants until we were very nearly through the belt of bush, or we should have been compelled to abandon our attempt. Ultimately, however, we effected the passage of the bush, and found ourselves fairly in the valley, with long dry grass, waist high, plenty of trees, big and little, but not much bush or creeper. And then we encountered potential trouble of a fresh kind, for although we were no longer attacked by ants, we too frequently heard rustlings in the long grass that we presently discovered to be caused by snakes, and we were compelled to walk very warily, lest we should perchance unwittingly tread upon one of the creatures and be bitten, perhaps fatally, as a punishment. I confess that, well, to put it plainly, I did not half like it, but what were we to do? We were searching for a cave, or shelter of some sort, that would serve us for a lodging and a place of protection in the event of a recurrence of bad weather, and we were not likely to find it by standing still. Also, we were looking for food, with a view to the future. But the question of supplies afforded us little anxiety, for banana and plantain trees were abundant in that valley, to say nothing of grapes and several other kinds of fruit. Coming to a banana tree, the fruit of which was fully ripe, we made a good meal, and then, feeling rather tired, we trampled down a smooth place in the grass, under the shade of a big tree, stretched ourselves thereon, and were soon fast asleep. Judging from the position of the sun in the heavens, it might be about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when I was awakened by somebody shaking me by the shoulder. And as I opened my eyes, I heard a voice I at once recognized as that belonging to Dirk here, who was saying, in a sort of whisper, "Hush! Don't make a noise, but just lift your head, cautious, and look." "Look where?" I returned, also in a sort of whisper, "and what am I to hush for?" "Look to your right, at Pete," which is the name by which we usually addressed Fleming, "lying fast asleep there, and see what you'll see," replied Dirk. I turned my head very cautiously and looked, and there, within less than a fathom of me, was Pete Fleming, lying flat on his back, fast asleep, with a snake coiled up like a cable right in the middle of his chest. The snake's head was resting upon the top flake of his coils, with his cold, cruel eyes gazing straight at us, and his long, black, forked tongue flickering in and out of his mouth in a most suggestively threatening manner. "What's the best thing to do?" murmured Dirk in low tones. "We must do something quickly, for if Pete awakes and stirs as much as an eyelid, the beggar will bite him, and then it will be all up with poor Pete." There was a small branch with a few twigs and a bunch of leaves on the end of it, lying on the ground within reach of my right hand. I contrived to get hold of this without disturbing the snake. Then, sitting up suddenly, I thrust the bunch of leaves on the end of the branch straight and hard at the reptile, and it vanished. That is the only way in which I can convey any idea of the rapidity with which it retreated. The next instant Pete was sitting up, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, and demanding with many choice forecastle embellishments what I meant by my fool tricks. When we explained to him the danger that he had so narrowly escaped, he had the grace to thank me for my intervention. But we all agreed that the spot had no longer any charm for us, and that it was high time for us to resume our search for a place where we might pass the night in safety. Such a place was by no means easy to find, but ultimately, within a few minutes of sunset, we came upon a sort of shelter among some rocks, of which we at once took possession, for our need was by this time urgent, total darkness being due in about 10 minutes. Pete was strongly of opinion that, wherever our shelter might be, we ought to light a fire in front of it to scare away wild beasts, and possessing a burning glass, he took the precaution to make fire with it before the sun sank too low, and to kindle a torch with it for the purpose of lighting our fire. So, having at length found our shelter, we forthwith proceeded to gather materials, light our protective fire, and dispose of ourselves for the night. Having found a refuge of sorts, we anticipated a good night's rest, but no sooner had darkness closed down upon us than from all quarters there arose a chorus of the most terrifying sounds: roars, barks, bellowings, savage growls, grunts, shrieks. Never in my life before had I heard anything like the pandemonium that raged around us. We heard the branches of trees being broken. Great stones came rattling and crashing down the steep hillside behind us, missing our shelter by only what seemed a series of miracles. There were heavy thuds, accompanied by blood-curdling snarls that suggested the progress of life-and-death fights between ferocious beasts, and at frequent intervals we caught, through the smoke of our fire, glimpses of great eyes glaring at us. Such was our first experience of night life in the wild. At length, however, toward morning, the racket gradually quieted down, and we snatched a short spell of sleep until sunrise, when we turned out and proceeded to hunt for breakfast. Luck was with us that morning, for we had not gone far when we found the partly eaten carcass of a fine fat deer. The creature had not been dead very long, for the blood about it was scarcely dry, and the meat was quite fresh. We were hungry and not too squeamish, so we got to work upon that deer and cut some fine steaks off a part of him that had not been touched by the thing that had killed him. And carrying the meat back to our shelter, we made up the fire and cooked ourselves a fine breakfast, finishing off with fruit as a substitute for the water that we failed to find. While partaking of breakfast, we discussed our future as castaways. With our experiences of the past night fresh in his mind, Fleming proposed a return to the beach and the construction of a raft, upon which, he suggested, we should paddle off to the wreck, with the view of giving her an overhaul, in the hope of finding something that would repay us for our trouble. But when it came to consideration of details, Dirk and I came to the conclusion that, with nothing but our sheath knives to serve as tools, the scheme was impracticable. What we might have attempted, had we known that you and Billy were alive and still aboard, is, perhaps, another matter. Several other schemes of an equally impractical character were suggested, only to be abandoned after discussion, until finally, failing any more satisfactory plan, we decided that if we could find a nice, comfortable cave to serve as a dwelling, we would experiment a bit upon Robinson Crusoe lines and see how we liked it. We found several caves of one sort and another that day, but the most suitable of them were already tenanted, as we could tell immediately that we put our nose inside them. Moreover, many of the tenants happened to be at home when we called, and seemed to resent our presence upon their doorsteps. Therefore, to avoid unpleasantness, we retired, in many cases rather precipitately. Ultimately, however, we came upon a cave that for some inexplicable reason was untenanted, and seemed to be everything that could reasonably be desired. It was situated high up on the side of the hill, and the entrance was so small that we were obliged to bend almost double in order to pass through. But once past the entrance, the cave widened out until its interior was as spacious as that of half a dozen forecastles knocked into one, with headroom of 10 or 12 feet. It had a beautiful, dry, soft, sandy floor, and, best of all, there was a pool of deliciously cool, sweet water at the far end of it, the first fresh water that we had found, and the air was as clean and sweet as the water. No zoological gardens odour, or taint of rotting bones, you understand. We took possession at once. Vividly remembering our experiences of the night before, our first business was to go out again and collect enough dry stuff to make a fire at the entrance to last all night. We next cut a sufficient quantity of the long, dry grass to provide each of us with a comfortable bed, and we completed our arrangements by cutting and conveying to the cave a bunch of bananas, big enough to furnish us with a supper that night and breakfast the next morning. Then, having supped, we built and lighted our fire, turned in, and slept soundly all night, notwithstanding that even in our sleep we were conscious of a repetition of all the weird sounds of the previous night. I suppose you will scarcely be anxious to hear the full details of every adventure that befell us during our sojourn in that valley, and indeed, if you did, I am afraid I could not relate them with much pretence to accuracy. Adventures enough and to spare there were, of one sort and another, but I seem to have got them all mixed up together, so that I am unable to say just exactly when any one in particular happened. The wild beasts did not very seriously trouble or interfere with us during the daytime, but the snakes more than compensated for this. They constituted a perfect terror. We grew so fearful of them at last, especially after our boots gave out, that we scarcely dared to put one foot before the other. Indeed, it was a snake that finally drove us out of the valley. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 16. Svorenssen relates an interesting story. It was while we were seeking fruit that the thing happened. We had crossed the valley and plunged into the forest on the other side, Dirk and I being together while Pete was a few yards away, when suddenly, as we were passing under the boughs of a big tree, I heard a kind of plop, and at the same instant Dirk gave a yell that very nearly scared me stiff. Glancing round to ascertain the cause of the disturbance, I was horrified to see Dirk enveloped in the coils of an enormous snake, whose ugly head was poised within a few inches of my shipmate's face, the creature's forked tongue flickering in and out of its widely opened jaws. I suppose I shall never be able to explain or account for the impulse that actuated me at this horrid sight, but the fact remains that, without pausing an instant to reflect, I thrust forward my left hand and gripped the snake just behind the head, while with my right I drew my sheath knife across the reptile's throat, pretty nearly severing the head from the body at one stroke. Instantly it became a case of "Stand clear!" The snake uncoiled itself from about Dirk's body, and proceeded to fling itself about on the ground with such terrific violence that the air around us was presently full of bits of grass, broken twigs, and flying leaves, while Dirk, yelling like a madman, flung himself upon the writhing body of the reptile, stabbing furiously here and there with his knife, but never touching the snake so far as I could see, while Pete came running up to ascertain what was the matter. We got Dirk away from the snake eventually, and helped him back to the cave, and when we got him there we stripped him to learn the extent of his injuries. To our great relief we found that there was very little the matter with him. He was much bruised about the body from his waist to his shoulders, but that was all. It was, however, enough. We agreed that Robinson Crusoeing was not quite all that in our boyhood days we had believed it to be, and we resolved to return to the beach on the following morning and endeavour to swim off to the wreck. When we started to work our way back to the beach, we discovered, to our annoyance, that the path which we had cut for ourselves through the scrub had become completely overgrown again. Consequently, we had all our former work to do over again, with the ants and mosquitoes even more pertinacious in their attentions than before. Thus the afternoon was well advanced when at length we caught once more a glimpse of blue water. By that time we were so utterly fagged that we felt it would be folly to attempt a long swim under such conditions. We therefore postponed our attempt until the next day. We saw that the wreck was still on the reef, apparently in no worse condition than when we had last viewed her, and with our experiences of life ashore still fresh in our memories, we told each other what fools we had been in making no attempt to get off to her again as soon as the weather had settled after our first landing. Pete Fleming was far and away the keenest of our little party to get aboard again. He directed us to observe how high she was standing out of the water, and expressed the opinion that for that reason it might be possible for us to penetrate to her lazarette, where we should doubtless find a quantity of tinned stuff that would be infinitely more palatable than the fruit diet upon which we had so long been subsisting, and of which we were all now thoroughly tired. And he was particularly eloquent upon the subject of drink, of which he seemed confident that we should find a considerable quantity. So keen indeed was he, that he was stripped and in the water 4 or 5 minutes before Dirk or myself, and was already swimming when we too started to wade in. And then a dreadful thing happened. We were little more than ankle deep when we heard him utter an awful shriek, and saw him throw up his hands and disappear in the midst of a violent swirl of water. In an instant the terrible truth burst upon us that the poor chap had been seized by sharks, the existence of which in the lagoon we had never suspected, and on the instant Dirk and I, moved by the same impulse, turned and fled back to the beach. The incident effectually cured us of any further desire to reach the wreck, and we never again ventured to attempt any swimming until a few days ago. Dirk and I camped on the beach again that night, building a fire round our camping place as a protection against wild beasts. But some time during the night I happened to awake to discover that our fire had burned perilously low, and that some 7 or 8 great brutes were hungrily prowling round us, their eyes gleaming like green lamps, and themselves apparently waiting only until the fire had burned a little lower, or their courage had grown sufficiently to enable them to leap in and seize us. I sprang up, awakening Dirk, and together we heaped fresh brushwood upon the smouldering ashes until the flames leaped up again, and then our visitors left us. But our narrow escape brought home to us realization of the extreme danger of sleeping in exposed situations, and after breakfast on the following morning we set out to return to our cave in the valley. How long we remained there on this occasion I cannot tell you, for we soon lost count of time, but it must have been several months certainly. For some time we lived exclusively upon fruit, but later on we contrived to secure a morsel of meat now and then. Upon one occasion, I am afraid you will not believe me, but I assure you it is true, we found a young deer tangled up in the biggest and toughest spider's web you ever saw, and of course we killed and ate the little creature. That spider's web suggested to us the idea of setting traps, which we made of monkey rope, and in which we sometimes caught small game of one sort or another. We should probably have been living in that cave to this day, but for another bad scare, and in that case we should never have known that you and Billy had survived the wreck, and should have made no attempt to join you. So perhaps it is as well for all of us that we had that scare. I was by no means certain that I fully agreed with Svorenson's view of this matter, but I said nothing, and the man continued his story. There was something very curious and uncanny about that scare, though just exactly what was the nature of it I cannot tell you, for we never found the explanation of the mystery. It was a long time before we observed anything in the least degree strange connected with our surroundings. At first, not only when Pete was with us, but later, when Dirk and I returned alone, we slept soundly all night and every night. But eventually there arrived a time when, now, how am I to say it so that you will understand me? "We had disturbing dreams," prompted Van Ryn. "Yes," agreed Svorenson, "that was it. We had disturbing dreams. At least, sometimes we thought they were dreams, while at other times we were convinced that they were real. The curious circumstance in connection with it was that the experiences began for both of us on the same night. It was our practice to build a big fire in front of the cave every night, to prevent the entrance of wild beasts while we slept, and on the night about which I am now going to speak, we did it as usual. We were never long in dropping off to sleep after we had composed ourselves for the rest of the night, and this particular night was no exception to the rule. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but it could not have been long, for our fire outside was still burning brightly, and the interior of the cave was brightly illuminated by it, when I suddenly started up, broad awake, with my hair on end, and the sweat of terror literally streaming from my every pore, for I was feeling more thoroughly scared than I had ever been before, and I was trembling like a leaf, and my teeth were chattering, although at the moment I had not the slightest notion what it was that had frightened me. Then I heard Dirk muttering to himself, and looking around I saw that he too was sitting up, looking as terrified as I felt. What is it, mate?" he stammered. "What's happened?" "That is exactly what I want to know," said he. "How come you to be awake?" "Hush!" whispered Dirk in a trembling voice. "Listen!" and he held up his hand for silence. I listened, and, believe me or not, as you please, it is the solemn truth I'm telling you, that cave was full of queer little mysterious noises, like people whispering, and the soft tread of feet all about us. I looked, and Dirk looked, but we could see nothing, yet the sounds continued, now seeming to come from the back of the cave, and then all about us. I believe I should have been far less terrified if I could have seen anything to account for the sounds, but there was nothing. Panic seized me. I sprang to my feet and rushed, shrieking, out of the cave, dashing headlong right through our fire, and coming a terrible cropper on the rough sloping ground in front of the cave. In falling I must have stunned myself, for I remember nothing more of what happened that night. But, and this I consider the most extraordinary part of the whole adventure, when I awoke next morning I found myself back in the cave again, lying upon my grass bed, with Dirk close alongside. "Ah," I commented, "quite a queer dream. What had Van Ryn to say about it? I suppose you mentioned it to him?" "I said dot it was no dream, for just what happened to Sorensen, the same thing happened to me," answered Van Ryn, speaking for himself. "Well, of course, that was very remarkable," I agreed. "Still, it could only have been a dream, since you found yourself, I understand, in the cave and on your own beds in the morning." "Ja, dot was so," assented Van Ryn. "But when we comes to overhaul ourselves, we found dot our hands and faces was badly skinned by our fall outside dot cave, and our hair and beards, as well as our clothes, was singed where we have shumped through the fire." "Indeed," said I, "that was certainly remarkable. If you are both quite sure that you did not imagine those very peculiar happenings. If you mean about our skinned hands and faces, and our singed hair and clothes, there was no imagination about that," asserted Svorenssen. "But about the other, well, when we came to talk about it in broad daylight, we were unable to decide whether we had actually heard the sounds, or whether we had dreamed them. You see, it was not as though the thing happened once only. It happened several nights running, and at length it got upon our nerves to such an extent that we could endure it no longer. So we agreed to return to the beach and work our way along shore, on the lookout for a break in the reef, abreast of which we proposed to camp, in the hope that sooner or later a ship might come along, enter the lagoon, and take us off." "A most sensible plan," said I, "and the only thing I am surprised at is that, to a couple of sailor men like yourselves, the idea did not come much earlier." "Aye," agreed Sorensen, "it is a pity that it did not. Had it done so, we should have no doubt have discovered that you were still alive much earlier than we did, and found means to signal to you." "No doubt," said I. "Well, what happened to you after you left the cave the second time?" "The first thing," replied Svorenssen, "was that we had the misfortune to lose Pete's burning glass, which left us without the means to light a fire. That was a terrible loss, for it left us defenceless against the attacks of wild beasts at night, so that we dared not camp anywhere in the open. Dirk remembered having heard that the natives of certain countries made fire by rubbing two pieces of wood together, and we tried the same plan over and over again. Indeed, we spent the better part of several days trying to get fire in that way, but without success. We could not even raise a whiff of smoke. That was about the worst misfortune that happened to us, for without fire to protect us at night, or cook food during the day, we were continually in difficulties. But it was not long before we discovered a method of cooking after a fashion, without fire. Of course you will understand that the only cooking we had to do was when we were able to obtain a morsel of meat, which was by no means every day. When we succeeded, we used to look about for a rock that had been exposed to the sun's rays for several hours, and when we had succeeded in our search, we cut our meat into thin slices and laid it upon the rock, which was hot enough to so far broil our meat as to render it quite eatable. We dare not camp out at night, even on the open beach. The beasts were certain to discover us somehow, and came prowling around, giving us not a minute's peace, and many a narrow escape we had from them. Thus we were compelled to get what sleep we could during the daytime, keep and watch, while at night we did such travelling as was possible. But that was not much, for more often than not we were driven to take refuge in trees, or retreat into the water, sitting in it up to our necks, while sharks cruising around within a few fathoms of us, and occasionally making dashes into the shallow water, and running themselves aground in their efforts to reach us. Ah, those were lively times, and no mistake, and often enough we used to tell each other that life was not worth living, yet we spared no pains to preserve it. Then, as though we had not already enough trouble, Dirk must needs fall sick of a fever of some sort, and became violently delirious. For 3 nights and 4 days I could do nothing with him. He was simply stark, staring mad. He would not permit me to approach him, but threatened me with his knife whenever he saw me. The only thing I could do was to keep him just in sight. At a pretty dance he led me, following him into the woods and all over the place, excepting into the water. Luckily for us both, he had sense enough to keep clear of that, or the sharks would assuredly have had him. But of course that sort of thing could not long continue, and towards the evening of the 4th day the poor chap collapsed, and as luck would have it, I found a comparatively safe refuge for him among some rocks, where I looked after and attended to him until he was well enough to be up and about again. But the fatigue, anxiety, and loss of rest told upon me so severely that no sooner was Dirk able to look after himself than I fell ill, and then it was his turn to look after me for about a fortnight. Then one day, when I was beginning to pull round a bit, Dirk, who had been out foraging for food, returned to our refuge in a great state of excitement, with the intelligence that he had just seen a sailing boat alongside the wreck. The statement greatly alarmed me, for, of course, I did not believe a word of it, and my fear was that my chum was suffering a relapse, and was again experiencing delusions. But when I suggested this idea to him, he indignantly scouted the idea, repeating his statement and bidding me crawl to the opening of the shelter and see for myself if I did not believe him. I took his advice. It was, of course, the obvious thing to do, and there, to my amazement, was the boat, unmistakably enough, with her masts stepped, rigging set up, and sails stowed. What was more, after looking intently for several minutes, I had the impression that I caught glimpses of one or two people moving about on board the wreck. We watched all that day, and the next, and the next, every moment expecting to see the boat leave the wreck, and all that time we were trying desperately hard to make a fire, and thus create a smoke, so that whoever was aboard the wreck would see it, and come across to ascertain what it meant. But try as we would, we were unable to manage it. Then one day Dirk went out to look at a trap which he had set in the woods, and upon his return he reported that the boat had left the wreck and was heading along the lagoon in a northerly direction, and that there were 2 people in her, a man and a boy. So we naturally concluded that it must be you and Billy, and that you had somehow escaped drowning after all. Then I said to Van Ryn, if you saw us as distinctly as that, why did you not show yourself on the beach and wave to attract our attention? I did, replied the Dutchman. Do you think I'm such a fool as to miss a chance? But you was not looking my way, not neither of you. And though I shout and yell and run along the beach, you take no notice, but sail on until at last you sails out of sight. That is very strange, said I, for whenever I was cruising in the lagoon, I always kept an eye on the shore. Then you must have been looking out abeam or ahead, not astern where I happen to be, declared Van Ryn. Possibly, I agreed, for I saw that the man was in a aggressively disputatious humour, and I wanted to have no words with him. Well, what happened after that? Go on with your yarn, Svorenssen. We saw you 3 or 4 times after that, resumed Svorenssen, and once you passed us so close that we easily recognised both of you. Unfortunately, we were both up a tree at the time and unable to descend, for the reason that there was a savage brute of a wild pig that has driven us up aloft and was waiting below for us to come down again. Of course, we shouted our loudest, and as long as there seemed any possibility that you might hear, but it was no good. I suspect it was the roar of the surf on the reef that drowned our voices, but every time we saw you, if you were not going alongside the wreck, you were steering north. So at length we came to the conclusion that you had probably rigged up some sort of shelter in that direction, and we accordingly agreed to work along shore in a northerly direction and try to find out where you had bestowed yourselves. To you, sailing along easily and comfortably in your boat, I dare say it would seem no very arduous job to work your way along a few miles of open beach. But to us two, circumstanced as we were, in a place swarming with savage brutes that seemed to be for ever lurking on the watch for us, without the means of kindling a fire as a protection, and with only our sheath knives as weapons, obliged to enter the woods at the peril of our lives to obtain food, and as often as not driven out again without the food, able to sleep only during the daytime, and very often not even then, compelled to seek shelter in trees for hours at a time, ay, and often enough for a whole day, to save our lives. It was simply, well, there are no words strong enough to describe it. Why, there were days, plenty of them, when we did not make as much as a mile of progress, when from one cause or another we did not make a fathom, much less a mile. No wonder that we were so long a time working our way round to you. Indeed, now that I look back upon the innumerable difficulties that we had to contend with, my only surprise is that we ever managed to get here at all. Then, as an appropriate climax of all our difficulties, the forest one day caught fire. Perhaps you saw the blaze, and almost the whole of the island was swept clean of every green thing. Phew, that was an experience, with a vengeance. If I had not beheld the scene with my own eyes, I could never have believed that there were so many wild creatures in all the world as we then saw. Great fierce monkeys, bigger than a man, little monkeys in thousands, leopards, wild pigs as savage as lions, deer of all sorts and sizes, and creatures the like of which we had never seen or heard of before. They all came swarming down to the beach to escape the flames, and a very curious circumstance I thought it. They were all so thoroughly terrified that none of them interfered with the others or with us, but all stood huddled together by the water's edge, bleating, squealing, roaring, howling. No, I cannot attempt to describe it. It is the kind of thing that has to be seen to be understood. Naturally, we all edged away as far as we could from the flames and the flying sparks, and eventually it began to dawn upon us, beasts as well as men, that the extreme north end of the island might possibly be spared, and we all with one accord set off in that direction. And for a little while, 24 hours or thereabout, we men did very well. The creatures all stood huddled together, trembling and making queer moaning noises, too terrified to take notice of anybody or anything. And when we needed food, all that was necessary was to lay hold of a deer, haul him out of the crowd and cut his throat, and there was all the food we required. But that condition of affairs was of course quite temporary. No sooner had the fire burned itself out than the creatures recovered their courage and turned upon each other like wild beasts. Dirk and I quickly recognised that the north end of the island was too perilous a place for us. There was therefore nothing for us but to escape from our dangerous neighbours while we could, and this could only be done by bearing away south again, which we did. There was no cause for further fear of wild beasts as we pursued our journey southward. There was not a living thing to be seen anywhere ashore. Even the birds had all vanished. That condition of affairs was of course all in our favour so far as it went, but the unfortunate part of it was that the fruit was also destroyed, so that while we could now rest undisturbed at night, our only food consisted of such raw shellfish as we could find at the margin of the beach, and we could find no fresh water wherewith to quench our thirst. For 2 days and nights we were in that predicament, our thirst being terrible, and the only relief we could obtain, and it was very partial, was to enter the sea and lie down in it for about 10 minutes, allowing the ripples to wash over us, and taking care not to go far enough in to give the sharks a chance to get at us. Then, when we felt sufficiently relieved, we staggered along for a few yards, repeating the process about 30 or 40 times a day. At length, however, we found a stream of fresh water and camped beside it. But so terrible had been our suffering from thirst that, having at length found fresh water, we could not summon the courage to leave it again. One day, however, as we were seeking shellfish on the beach near the mouth of the stream, Dirk suddenly remarked, "Olaf, my son, just run your eye along the ridge of that hill yonder and tell me what you see." I did so, and presently saw what had attracted his attention. There was a little patch of green that looked as though it might be trees, while all below it was black where the fire had been. "It certainly looks like a clump of trees," said I, "and where there are trees there will probably also be fruit. Let us take a walk up there and investigate." "And what about leaving this fresh water?" asked Dirk. "No need to do that," said I. "The stream comes down from that direction, and we can probably follow it for a good part of the way. Surely it is worth while to risk it." So we started, following the course of the stream until we arrived very near to our destination, and when that was reached we found it to be a nice little patch of forest, rising to the top of the hill and dipping down on the other side of it for a distance of about 2 miles. And the reason why it had not been burnt with the rest was because it stood on the lee side of a lake big enough to cut off the flames from that little patch. There were plenty of birds there, and when we proceeded to investigate, we soon found that there were animals also, small monkeys, creatures very like hares but with short ears. A few deer, but nothing dangerous so far as we could discover, and there was an abundance of fruit of several kinds also. We therefore quickly determined to settle down there and rest a bit before going any farther. There was a great patch of reeds along the western end of the lake, and here thousands of wild ducks used to settle every night, and we soon found that it was an easy matter to get a few by simply waiting for them among the reeds and catching them as they swam past. We built ourselves a hut of wattles, thatched with palm leaves, that kept us dry and comfortable when it rained. So happy and easy in our minds were we that we almost forgot your existence, and when we happened to remember, we used to say to each other, "Never mind, we are every bit as comfortable as they are. We will stop on here a bit longer." And so we did, deferring our departure day after day and week after week, until finally the ducks grew shy of us, and the other creatures seemed to recognise our traps and avoid them, so that at length the time came when we were pretty hard put to make a living. Then too we began to feel lonesome and get snappy and short-tempered with each other, and to dream and think and talk about home and its comforts, until we grew thoroughly dissatisfied with the life we were living. And one day, after we had had one of our now frequent quarrels, I said to Dirk, "Look here, mate, we appear to have quite forgotten those other two. Do you think a man of brains, like Mr. Blackburn, is going to settle down and be satisfied to pass the remainder of his life among a group of desert islands like these? Because if you do, I don't. Just consider the facts. There he is, and the boy, and you may safely bet that, whatever else they may have done, or left undone, they will have taken care to save the treasure that we found aboard that old galleon. And what good will it do them so long as they remain here? No good at all. Therefore I think we may take it for granted that he will set his wits to work to get away from here by hook or by crook, taking the treasure with them. And then where do we come in, and what becomes of our share of it? Let us cut adrift from this spot, which anyhow is of no further use to us, and join them, and when they go we will go with them and take our share of the treasure." Dirk quite saw the force of my reasoning, eagerly agreed to my proposal, so we made a start there and then, and here we are. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 17. Is Trouble Brewing? Exactly, I concurred. Here you are. But how did you know where Billy and I had located ourselves, and how did you contrive to make your way here from the southern end of West Island? West Island, is that the name of the place? Oh, we managed pretty well, returned Svorenssen. From the ridge of the hill where the forest was all burned away, we were able to get a very fair idea of the geography of the group in general. We counted 6 islands in addition to the one we were already on, and we observed that the one to the eastward of us was, like our own, fire-swept. Also that at one point it was separated from our island by a channel only about half a mile wide. To the northward of that island we saw another, with small groups of trees dotted about here and there upon it, while the remainder of its surface appeared to be covered with cornfields or something similar. So it is not to be wondered at if we jump to the conclusion that we should find you established there. So we made a start by heading for the narrowest part of the channel between our own island and the next one, carrying with us as much fruit as we could handle, for we knew not when or where we should find more. Upon reaching the channel, the question that confronted us was, How were we going to get across? We could see but one way, and that was to swim it. But what about sharks? We had already lost one of our number through them, and we had no desire that a similar fate should befall either of us. Therefore we camped alongside that channel 2 days, and while one of us foraged for food, the other just sat and intently watched the water. And when the evening of the second day arrived without disclosing any sign of sharks in the channel, we agreed to risk the passage. So we stripped off our clothes, or what remained of them, made them into a bundle, secured them upon our heads, and waded in. We got across safely, and were lucky enough to land just where a little stream of fresh water came down from the hill that rose in the middle of the island. We camped alongside the stream that night, and made our supper of melons and ground nuts that had grown since the passage of the fire over the land. On the following day we proceeded inland, following the course of the stream and heading toward the top of the hill, from which we hoped to obtain a little further knowledge of the geography of the group and also, it might be, some more definite information as to your own whereabouts. And we were successful in both particulars, for while we were on the top of that hill we saw your sailing boat coming round the eastern end of the island across the channel northward of us. Watching you, we saw you land on that island, stay there a while, and then sail away again in a northeasterly direction. Upon seeing this, Dirk and I came to the conclusion that the proper thing for us to do would be to descend to the beach and there await your next appearance, when we would signal you. We had already detected a little stream flowing down the hillside and discharging into the channel, quite near the spot where we decided to await your reappearance, so we followed it down to the water's edge, where we camped. Then that same evening your boat again hove in sight, and we saw you land a party of niggers just opposite where we were watching, having done which you again made sail to the northward and eastward, which led us to the conclusion that after all you had not settled upon that cultivated island, as we had at first supposed, but somewhere else. Of course we showed ourselves upon the beach, and hailed, but the channel was too wide for our voices to carry across, and probably you never looked in our direction, so we failed to attract your attention. But we knew now that you were still on the group, and that we were on your track, so we did not trouble overmuch. Then, before your boat had passed out of sight, and while we were still watching, we saw a nigger paddling across the channel from the island you had touched at to the one that we were upon. He was heading to land at a spot rather more than a mile to the eastward of where we were, so we got back into the young growth that had sprung up after the fire, and pushed along toward the spot for which he was making. We arrived a few minutes before he did, and, crouching down, we saw him haul up his tub of a canoe on the beach, and make his way inland. We allowed him to get well away from the beach, and then we crept down to the canoe, launched her, and proceeded to paddle in the track of your boat. It fell dark almost before we had got fairly under way, but there was a fine moon, so it did not greatly matter. We paddled down the channel and across it to the point round which you had recently vanished. A good 8 miles we reckoned it to be, and hot work it was for 2 men who had been on short commons for more than a month. But we forgot all about that when, upon rounding the point, we saw, at a distance of not more than 5 or 6 miles, a light, and we knew that now you could not be very far away, while we were in possession of the means to reach you. But it was a tough job to get that little tub of the niggers along when once we had rounded the point, for at once we felt the full strength of the easterly breeze, and it and the popple it raised were together just as much as we could barely stem. It must have taken us hours to get across that 5 or 6 miles of water, and long before we landed you had put all lights out and turned in. But there was the house, plain enough to be seen in the bright moonlight, so we headed straight for it, and landed at last on the beach just below. "And what became of the punt that you stole from that unfortunate native?" I demanded. "Why, I reckon she's still there on the beach where we left her," was the reply. "Still there!" I exclaimed. "Why, yes, I suppose she is. This must be looked to at once. Billy, take this man, Van Ryn, with you, and get him to show you where they left the punt. Then you and he will paddle her round to the cove here, and make her fast astern of the sailing boat. Then get the sailing boat under way, and Van Ryn will point out to you the spot on Apes Island from which he and Svorenssen took her." "Not me, mister, don't you think it!" suddenly stormed the Dutchman. "You're not my skipper now, and I don't take orders from you or anybody else. We're all equal now." "Are we?" said I, slipping my hand into my jacket pocket. "That's where you are making a big mistake, my man. I mean to be just as much skipper here as I was aboard the Yorkshire Lass. And if you men wish to share in the comforts of life that I am able to give you, and to go home with me when I go, you will have to submit to discipline and obey my orders." "Oh, we'll see about that," interrupted Van Ryn, springing to his feet. "Olaf, mein son, have we come all this way from over yonder to be ordered about mit this man? Let's show him dat we mean to do as we likes here. Come on." And, whipping out the remains of his sheath knife, he gathered himself together for a spring upon me, with one eye on Svorenssen meanwhile, in full expectation that the latter would back him up. But I was fully prepared. There had been, from the moment when I first encountered these two men, early that morning, a certain truculence of speech and demeanor that warned me against trusting them too implicitly, and I had been on my guard with them all day. So now, as the Dutchman sprang to his feet, I sprang to mine, and, leaping back from them, out of arm's reach, I whipped out the revolver that I had been carrying all day in my jacket pocket, and shouted, "Hands up, both of you! Don't so much as think of trying conclusions with me, for if either of you advance a single step, I shoot to kill. I remember the reputation you two men, and you especially, Van Ryn, earned for yourselves aboard the brigantine. You were perpetually instigating trouble. But don't for a moment imagine that you will be permitted to make trouble here, for I simply won't have it. At the first hint of anything of that sort I'll hand you over to my friends, the natives of yonder island, and ask them to take charge of you. Indeed, I believe it would only be an act of ordinary prudence to turn you over to them at once." "No, no, mister," interposed Svorenssen hurriedly. "Don't think of it. There ain't going to be any trouble, I assure ye. Don't take any notice o' what Dirk says, mister. His bark's always a lot worse than his bite. He don't mean a half nor a quarter of what he says. Sit down, you thundering fool, and put away that knife of yours," he continued, turning suddenly upon the Dutchman and forcing him back on the packing case upon which they had both been sitting, and seating himself beside him. Then he leaned over his companion and began whispering hurriedly and excitedly in his ear. "Stop that, Svorenssen!" I exclaimed. "If you have any advice to give that man, speak it aloud so that I may hear. If it is good advice, there is no need to whisper it." "All right, mister," returned the Finn. "I was only telling him not to make a bloomin' fool of hisself. And now, come on, Dirk, and let's do what Mr. Blackburn orders. What he says is right. He's skipper still, and we may's well recognize it first as last. You know as well as I do that we can't do nothin' without him. Come along, Billy." Thereupon the two men rose to their feet and proceeded to slouch along the shore in the direction of the spot where they had left the punt. "On second thoughts," said I, "go, you two men, and bring the punt round here to the cove, and Billy and I will come out in the sailing boat to meet you." Svorenssen waved his hand to indicate that he understood, and the two men continued on their way, the Finn, I observed, talking very earnestly to his companion. As soon as they were out of sight, Billy and I walked down to the boat, boarded her, got under way, and worked her round to the south beach, off which we fell in with and took the punt in tow. The breeze was blowing moderately fresh, which enabled us to make the trip to Apes Island in a trifle over 2 hours, at the end of which we found the unfortunate native, squatted on his haunches, anxiously awaiting deliverance from the former haunt of his enemies, where I perceived the young vegetation was already flourishing vigorously. We at once took the man aboard, where, during our passage across to Cliff Island, I explained to him as best I could the episode of the stolen punt, to the amazement of the two seamen, who seemed to regard as wonderful the fact that in the course of a year I had acquired a fairly fluent command of the natives' language. I observed with satisfaction that, when Bowata and a considerable company of the natives came down to the beach to greet us upon seeing our boat heading for the landing place, the two seamen looked more than a trifle uneasy, fearing perhaps that I would seize the opportunity to fulfill my threat to hand them over to the charge of the blacks, and I was not sorry to let them see, thus early, what a powerful force of auxiliaries I had behind me should they be meditating anything in the nature of an undue assertion of independence. I designedly directed the particular attention of Bowata and his followers to my new companions, explaining who and what they were, but of course the shellbacks understood nothing of what I was saying, and they made little or no attempt to conceal their relief when I at length bade farewell to the blacks and we made sail again upon our return to Eden. On the following morning I resumed work upon the cutter, and I thought that Van Ryn and Svorenssen looked somewhat disconcerted when, in accordance with my arrangement with Bowata, a party of 10 sturdy natives arrived at the shipyard about 8 a.m. in the Chinese boat I had given them, to lend us a hand as and when required. But the two seamen turned to without demur, and I soon had reason to congratulate myself upon my acquisition of them, for while Svorenssen revealed an almost professional skill in the use of carpenter's tools, the Dutchman explained that if I would cut out the cutter's sails, he would undertake to make them to my entire satisfaction. Both men did much more and far better work than I in the least anticipated, and when at length we knocked off work for the day, and I surveyed the result of that one day's work, I felt that I might now at last begin to calculate, with some approach to accuracy, the date at which our labours might be expected to come to a successful conclusion. 2 days later Van Ryn, who was working at the new sails under the shade of a tree at some distance from the shipyard, requested that, if possible, I would spare Billy to assist him, and as the request seemed reasonable I acceded to it without demur. Thereafter matters went so smoothly for a fortnight or more that, in my satisfaction at the progress we were making, I almost forgot the suspicions which the attitude and utterances of the two seamen had aroused when they so unexpectedly reappeared upon the scene. With their assistance, work upon the cutter had progressed so speedily that the planking of her was completed, the laying of her deck about half done, her mast and bowsprit finished, and her mainsail and gaff topsail sewn and in process of roping. I therefore estimated that another month would see my ambitious project complete and possibly ourselves at sea. But my complacency was somewhat disturbed when, on a certain evening, I was instructing Billy in the problem of the reduction of the sun's altitude to the meridian. I had concluded my explanation of the problem, when the boy, glancing up at me with a smile, remarked, "That chap Van Ryn is awfully inquisitive, Mr Blackburn. He was chaffing me to-day upon the difference in my manner of speaking now from what it was when he first knew me, and I said, yes, I had to thank you for it, for you had insisted I should study and improve my education every evening since we had been cast away. Then he wanted to know all about what you had taught me, and how much I knew, and I told him that you had been teaching me arithmetic, geometry, algebra, trigonometry, geography, and navigation, and that last word surprised him, I can tell you. It was amusing to see how interested he at once became. He wanted to know just how much I knew about navigation, and he would hardly believe me when I told him that I knew enough to enable me to determine a ship's position, day or night, provided that the sky was clear and I could get a sight of certain heavenly bodies. But when I insisted that I could do all I had said, he seemed no end pleased. Ah, he said, I must tell Svorenssen what you say. He will be glad to hear it. It was only a few nights ago that we were talking about the time when we should leave these islands, and saying what a fix we should all be in if Mr Blackburn should meet with another accident, or fall ill while we were at sea. And so you really believe, Billy, that if such a thing should happen, you could navigate the cutter?" I said I was quite sure I could, and then the conversation dropped, but he kept harking back to it, time after time, showing that he was still thinking about it. "Yes," said I can quite believe it, and I can understand, too, his amazement at your assurance that you, a mere boy, could, if put to it, navigate the cutter, or any other craft for that matter. There is probably not one boy in 10,000 of your age, Billy, who could truthfully claim such ability. But two circumstances have been in your favor. In the first place, you are naturally a sharp, intelligent lad, with a strong predilection for study; and in the next place, there was little else for you to do on this group but learn, until we started to build the cutter. Now, Billy, what you have told me relative to Van Ryn's inquisitiveness and his cross-questioning of you has greatly interested me, for a reason which I will explain later on. Therefore, while I am not as a rule inquisitive, I will ask you to make a point of reporting to me the substance of any further conversations which the man may hold with you, and to take very particular notice of any questions he may ask you. And now let us return to the consideration of our nautical problem. At the moment it seemed strange that Billy's story should so powerfully have affected me, but the fact remains that it did. After we had turned in that night, I lay restlessly tossing upon my bed, wondering whether Van Ryn's questioning of Billy was the natural result of pure, unadulterated inquisitiveness, or whether it had a deeper significance. The conversation appeared to have arisen naturally enough. I could not detect, in the relation of it, any indication of a deliberate attempt on the part of the man to lead up to the subject of Billy's educational acquirements. What reason, indeed, could he have for doing so, apart from the lad's more refined mode of speech? The matter that most powerfully exercised me was the Dutchman's eager curiosity to discover the full extent of Billy's qualifications as a navigator. Yet, even as to this, there seemed little enough reason for uneasiness. The man had given a quite plausible reason for such curiosity, a reason that I could perfectly understand and appreciate, but I wondered whether it was the actual reason, or was there another and more sinister one at the back of his evil mind? In any case, what, I wondered, could have put the thought in the Dutchman's head that something might possibly happen to me while we were at sea? Certainly the experience had already befallen him once since the commencement of the voyage, but with men of such limited intelligence as that of Van Ryn and Svorenssen, even such an experience as that usually makes so very transitory an impression that it soon fades. Moreover, the difficulty had been surmounted, and they would naturally believe that, should it arise again, it could again be surmounted in the same way. The only reason that I could think of why such an idea should have taken so strong a hold upon the Dutchman's mind was that, under certain circumstances, the eventuality of which he had spoken might be very much more than possible, it might be inevitable. Reasoning thus, I next asked myself the question, should anything happen to me, should I, for instance, die, either aboard the cutter or before leaving the islands, how would my death affect the fortunes of those two men, Svorenssen and Van Ryn, to say nothing of that of Billy? And why should it be desired to get rid of me? Those were not difficult questions to answer. In either of the above hypothetical cases the boy would be absolutely in the power and at the mercy of the two men, and I shuddered to think of what would happen to him, with me out of the way. Svorenssen and Van Ryn were both big, powerful men, and, should they resort to violence, what could a boy do by way of resisting them? Then the cutter was now so far advanced that, at a pinch, the two seamen could complete her, launch her, and make her ready for sea without my assistance. Their escape from the group was therefore in any case assured, while, so far as the navigation of the craft was concerned, they had already wormed out of Billy the information that he was competent to undertake that. But if the two seamen were actually conspiring against me, as I now began to think was at least probable, their primary object would doubtless be to secure the whole of the treasure for themselves. They doubtless recognized that so long as I, a man as powerful as either of them, with a mind already tinctured with suspicion of them, lived, to attempt to secure more than their fair share of the treasure might be both difficult and dangerous, and possibly even result in failure. But with me effectually disposed of, the enterprise would wear a totally different aspect. They would complete the cutter, sail away in her, with the treasure on board and Billy as navigator, willing or unwilling, and upon arriving within sight of their destination they would murder the poor boy, and the rest would be easy, or so they would probably believe. Yes, knowing the men so well as I did, I felt that there was ground for suspicion of them, and I resolved that, without appearing to do so, I would henceforth keep a wary eye upon them both, and be constantly, day and night, on my guard against any act of treachery on their part. Now it was not often that Billy did anything foolish, but boys will always be boys, to the end of time, I expect, and about a week after the lad's conversation with me on the subject of Van Ryn's inquisitiveness, the spirit of mischief suddenly seized him, and, just for a lark, as he subsequently admitted to me, he must needs leave the Dutchman upon some pretence, run up to the house, and then pay us a visit at the shipyard, bringing Kit with him on a leash, that he might enjoy the consternation of the natives at the sight of the leopard. It was fortunate that I spotted the pair when I did, for the beast was already beyond Billy's control and dragging the lad helplessly after him with the evident determination to interview the strangers more closely. The animal, although not yet fully grown, had developed into a magnificent specimen of his kind, as big as a mastiff and about twice as powerful. To hold him, when I hurriedly relieved Billy of his charge, taxed my strength to such an extent that I was obliged to shout to the workers to quit work and get into hiding at a safe distance. But even so, the scent of the men excited Kit to such an extent that it was only with utmost difficulty I was able to drag him back to the bungalow and safely lash him up. I was therefore not very greatly surprised when, after work was over that evening, Svorenssen approached me and said, "See here, mister, did ye happen to salve the arms chest from the wreck before she washed off the reef and foundered?" "Yes," I said. "What about it?" "Why, just this," he blustered. "Me and Dirk wants a brace of revolvers, cartridges, and a cutlash apiece out of that chest. That's what about it." "Really," said I. "A very modest request, very modestly put. Is it permissible to ask why you want those things, and in what way you purpose to use them?" "Oh, yes, certainly," was the reply. "There's no objections to you asking as many questions as you bloomin' well likes. We wants 'em to protect ourselves against that snarlin', savage leopard of yours. It ain't safe to be on the same island with the brute." "He will not interfere with you or molest you in any way if you give him a wide berth," I retorted. "As to giving you the weapons you demand, I won't do it, so that's flat." "You won't, eh?" returned the Finn, glowering at me savagely. "Then all I can say, mister, is that me and Dirk will have to see what can be done about protectin' ourselves. I, for one, ain't going to take the risk of being tore to pieces, no, not for another day, and so I gives you warnin'." "Now, see here, Svorenssen," said I can make allowance, and do, for your very natural fear of the leopard; but, as I have already told you, the animal will not hurt either of you men if you keep clear of him. And don't let me hear any more of such talk as you have been indulging in during the last few minutes. You forget yourself, my man, and you seem to forget also that you came to this island of your own free will. I did not invite you. I did not even want you. I was doing quite well without your assistance, as I can again if necessary. So let me have no more threats of any sort, or I shall be compelled, for peace and quietness' sake, to request my friend Bowata and his people to take charge of you. This is not the first time that you have obliged me to say this. I shall not again repeat it. Let there be no more bickering between us. The cutter is very nearly completed, and, please God, we shall soon be at sea in her and on our way back to civilization and home." The man stared at me for several seconds with, I thought, murder in his eyes. Then he turned away, remarking, "All right, mister, you're top dog now, and what you says goes, but—" I affected not to catch that final word, but proceeded to indicate to the natives the several jobs upon which I wished them to employ themselves on the morrow. But what, I wondered, was the explanation of this fresh outburst of turbulence on Svorensen's part? For fresh it was. Only once before had he displayed such insolence of manner to me, and I wondered whether, perchance, it had any connection with the suspicions that had been bred in my mind by Billy's report of the Dutchman's recent conversation with him. But, I argued, those suspicions might be wholly unfounded, and be the result of a certain unsuspected mental disorder brought about by the long series of unusual experiences through which I had passed, beginning with the destruction of the Saturn. In any case, whether my suspicions were well founded or otherwise, there could be no disputing the fact that the two seamen were turbulent, unruly, violent characters, liable at any moment to become dangerous, and therefore they must be carefully watched. As for voluntarily furnishing them with weapons, and so rendering them 10 times more dangerous than they already were, if Svorensen really imagined I would do such a thing, he must surely have set me down for a fool. From this time forward, without appearing to do so, I maintained a close watch upon both men, noting and weighing their every word, and endeavouring to deduce from their general conduct, and especially from their demeanour toward myself, whether or not they were really hatching a plot against me. But for rather more than a week I was unable to detect anything to justify the least apprehension on my part. Of course, it was impossible for me to observe the pair when they were alone together after the day's work was done; but although Svorensen maintained his usual surly demeanour, I attached little importance to that, for I believed it to be natural to him, while there was no doubt that both men were working steadily and well. End of chapter 17. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.